We're going to talk about building a healthy board culture for difficult times. And many of the conversations we started, many of the questions we started, bring us back to board culture. I'm so appreciative that Amada tees up this information so well. She's got the national data. She's using it to compare with the SAIS data. And we all want to start with data in terms of making decisions. And then, of course, you have Debra, she is the national depository of stories and incidents and examples of when boards have both behaved well and unfortunately when they haven't behaved well. So, and so much of it talks about culture. So NAIS says, what's the job description for you all? To understand fully the roles and responsibilities. There are three important words there. Roles, we want to talk about that. Responsibilities, we want to talk about that, and boundaries. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those issues. The challenge, of course, is that it's a messy business. NAS, in the preface to the handbook, says that very nicely. And then you got to get a little bit deeper into the handbook before we honestly stand up and say, guess what? This is a messy business. And why? If you ask the researchers, if you ask the scholars why this is messy, is because you may, without any action on your part, find impossible situations being thrown upon you, the choices you have to make. And it wasn't they never talked to you about that, I suspect, when they were recruiting you to come to the board. You know, they talk about generative ideas and innovation and being a disruptor, right? Yeah, well, how about some messy situations too? Your responsibility, of course, as Reisman told us, is to balance the immediate and the long term. You have to pay attention to the immediate, you know, unless you've got a sugar daddy or mother out there, the budget has to balance. You know, and if the annual fund doesn't meet its goal, if the enrollment isn't good, that's something that you as board members need to be concerned about as the head brings you those issues. Welcome. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, decisions weren't made in the spotlight. Decisions weren't made in a 24/7 news cycle. Decisions weren't made, and sometimes the head of school or the board chair finds out about the decisions here after incidents have happened. But you have to do that in the spotlight. And you don't have any choice to say no comment. You know this now. We all know this because we've worked with the communications experts who aren't just communications experts. They now call themselves crisis communication experts, right? Well, wasn't it a wonderful day where we could just talk about communications? But now it's crisis communications. And they will tell you, never say no comment, because you know where that goes, and it doesn't go in a positive direction for you or your school. And isn't it always lovely when the major newspapers in America, I suspect the major newspapers in your town, when they talk about our schools, they always use two adjectives. The elite, rich private school. Right? That's always how we're described out there. So it's in the spotlight. And you are balancing competing interests. That is your responsibility, to weigh the competing interests. And the problems that you deal with are often problems that ask us to deal with the competing interests. And then, of course, you have to act as a group. What's this group stuff, Jack? I had a board member who was about to, his term limits were about to come about, and his wife was a major marketer in America. Sold, any of you know anything about dolls, invented, created, developed that line of dolls that everybody in America had, and based in Chicago, but now based all over the world. And I once said to that individual, would you like to join the board after your husband's term expires? You're a marketing genius, you're bright, you're creative, you're always pushing me. And she looked at me and she said, are you crazy? I thought I was a pretty good head. I didn't think I was crazy. She said, Jack, in my company, privately held, I get an idea. We go and do a little R&D on it. We bring the idea back. We talk about it, and then I make a decision. None of this consensus stuff. You know, sit around the room and let's be collegial. I'm going to use that word later. That's not. I would be your worst nightmare as a board member, Jack. So no, come to visit me twice a year, and we will talk, and then we'll have lunch. And I was exhausted after that, and I would have 20 ideas. And this is, you know, the company was sold to Mattel for $750 million. That person's probably bright and capable, right? But a board member in a nonprofit organization or in a school, never, she said. And then you have to deal with the challenges of, to whom are you accountable? The parents? The faculty? The students? The alums? Or as Reisman tells us, the future. How can you be accountable to the future? But you have to figure that out as you go through that. So if you're new, this is from Trower and Eckel, but if you're new, you may think, who invited me to do this job? This is a nightmare. This is not a job that one wants to do. So what we want to do, though, is to talk about, not about the nightmares necessarily, but we want to ask you to think about it, and I'm sure you already do, to think about it on that higher level, to think about it as contributing to the Commonwealth, to the higher good of our society. And dysfunctional governance contributes to the erosion of public trust. Plenty of that out there today. We don't, as independent schools, need to be participants in eroding to that. But as the National Commission pointed out, is that when educational institutions, there's so much written at the college and university level that I think speaks to the work we do, that when we don't perform well, then we aren't contributing. It's not just the second grade or our school or the town, it's really to the common good. So I'd ask you to think of your roles, not just about what's going on in the second grade or what the future of the school is, but to think of the role of independent schools. And the responsibility of independent school trustees and heads is to contribute to the common good, to the greater good of all. So here's from Trower, and this is a little shift. We've spent a lot of time in the last, I don't know, decade or more thinking about roles and responsibilities, and those are important, and boundaries, and those are important. But the scholars now are saying it's really about cultures, that we can define roles and responsibilities. We can show you the chart and draw the diagonal lines and say, here's the heads area, and here's the boards area, but if we don't create the kinds of cultures, that's what we're going to do here this morning, if we don't create the kinds of cultures that support a positive board, then it's not going to work well. So, and what is this culture? Someone asked, well, how do you build this culture? I had a wonderful faculty member who taught 9th grade history in a school I used to work at, and unlike many of our history courses in the past, he didn't do it chronologically. You know, we didn't start at some point and end at the other point and race through everything in between. He started the class off by asking 9th graders, let's talk about culture. And the kids looked at him and said, huh? What are you talking about? What is your culture? What are your cultural backgrounds? And they spent the first 2 weeks wrestling with that question and wrestling with it throughout the rest of the year. But the question of how one defines a board culture and what the unwritten assumptions are, that's what you want to think about. We can read about the roles. You can have the wonderful job description for what you're supposed to do as a board member. And when someone doesn't behave well, it's always easier to hand them that job description and say, you know, Jack, here's why we're going to ask you to leave the board, because you're really not fulfilling the job responsibilities that we asked you to fulfill, as opposed to, you know, Jack, you don't contribute to the culture of our board very well. That's a very different conversation. Trower and company think that it really is those patterns of behavior and ways of understanding that are ingrained. People understand how the board operates, that culture is all about. And we all know this, you know, whoever you want to attribute this to, and multiple people take credit for this or attribute it to different people, right? That organizational culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But guess where boards go first when confronted with problems? They go to strategy. They jump into strategy first. Tom Peters, in his most recent book, talked about IBM and the turnaround in the IBM, and noted that culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it's the whole game. But it's so much easier to look at the job responsibilities and to act on those job responsibilities, maybe in a fiduciary sense or in a strategic sense, than to talk about culture. But that's what we're going to try and do here before lunch. I hope that you stay with me. And Trower says that, you know, you got to get into that boardroom, and you, in some ways, almost have to step back. Particularly, the board chair and the head of school have major responsibilities for this. You need to step back and watch the dynamics. You need to, you know, it's sort of Margaret Mead, participant observer kind of role, you know, field anthropologist. You need to wonder aloud who speaks, who doesn't speak, who speaks often, who doesn't speak after certain people speak, or how long is the silence or the gap after one person speaks before someone else will speak up. and wonder aloud if that's the way you want to go. That's board culture. It's the unwritten assumptions. Our students have to navigate that all the time. When they're new to kindergarten, when they're new to middle school, when they're new to the secondary school, the upper school, whatever we want to call it, that we send you all these handbooks, right, that have all the rules and the policies and what you're supposed to do, what you aren't supposed to do, and we have the same handbooks for the faculty, what they're supposed to do, what they aren't supposed to do, but we don't send out handbooks that talk about school culture too often. We talk about the values, and we say it defines school culture. But the people who navigate school culture better than anybody are your sons and daughters when they're brand new. And they can do that when they're in kindergarten, they can pick that up, or when they're in high school. How scary is it? How scary is it to be the new 9th grader in a K-12 school where everybody's been together since kindergarten? Not only is the developmental process all messed up in terms of that person, 9th graders think everybody's looking at them, when in fact no one really cares about them. They only care about themselves, right? That's basic, that's psychology, adolescent psychology 101. But this school culture thing, this board culture thing, sound like George W. Bush, is what we need to give some careful consideration to. So what is it? So what are some indicators of positive board culture? And here, as Amada said, this comes from Board Source. Google it, get a membership to it, wonderful organization. SAIS is a wonderful organization. NAS is a wonderful organization. Find out information from these folks because they're really good. Their research is quite good. What are indicators? It's a healthy and respectful partnership, and there's a lot of information written. NAS has lots of information. What does that partnership mean? What does it look like in terms of how communication occurs? Trust and candor among board members. First of all, how do you note it? How do you measure it? And then how do you act on it? There's the unwritten assumption. There's the unwritten rules, the trust and the candor. How willing am I to speak up after the school's major donor says, I think what we really need to do is to build that turf, put new turf on the football field, and I'm in for $1 million. Who else is going to join me? And then someone says, good. And there's a great meeting in the parking lot after the meeting about that comment. But it doesn't happen in the board meeting sometimes. No offense against people who believe in turf fields and want to give money for that. But pick your topic, whatever it is. Makerspace, new art museum. We need 7,500 more square feet to hang paintings on and work of the children on. That's a really good thing. And I'm going to pay for it, Jack. And what does the board do? What we really need to do is work on the professional development fund for our faculty. Maybe we need more money for IT. I don't know. But that's what the board culture is about. That's what the partnership is about. That's the conversation that the head and the board chair ought to be able to have. What do you do about Jack? He carries this big stick, which is called $1 million donation. And guess what? None of us think we need a new turf field or we need new museum space. In a healthy board culture, that conversation can occur in the boardroom without offending the major donor? It's a good question. We're going to have a few ways to test that out. Thoughtful and productive resolution of issues and disagreements. This is kind of like marriage therapy, I think. My wife's a psychologist. So how do you learn how to disagree? Heads of school know this. Before you take a job, before the board offers you a position, and they'll tell you all the roles and responsibilities and potential goals and the things that went well in the past and the things that they want you to do in the future. I think an important question for heads of school before you sign on the dotted line is with the chair, so how are we going to disagree? Because we're going to disagree, right? I mean, I don't know, I didn't go into a marriage thing saying to Carol, how are we going to disagree? That's 31 years ago, and I've learned how to disagree with my wife, so that's okay. You learn that on the job. But heads of school need to know, and those of you who are, how many of you are chairs of the board? Okay. And the others are trustees who aren't chairs, but are trustees, right? Yeah. But there's a fair number of chairs of the boards of trustees, right? Chairs of boards of trustees. So we need to think about thoughtful and productive resolutions of issues and disagreements. How are you going to deal with that? Because if you don't, what you end up with is groupthink, right? Everybody goes down one way and that's all that they think about. And a willingness to address poor board behavior that's negatively affecting the board. Many people, Debra alluded to this, many people think the Finance Committee is the most important committee on the board. I don't. I think the research tells us. It's the Governance Committee or the Trustee Committee or whatever you call it, because that's the committee that helps, along with the board chair, to evaluate the board, which, you know, actually the number, Amada, when I first saw it, a third of our schools, you know, don't do thoughtful evaluations. A third of our schools don't even give the head an annual goal. That's scary to think about that. But the Governance Committee ought to be the committee that's sort of is the watchdog. It's not a good word these days, but is paying attention to how the board is functioning, who the board thinks we ought to recruit, why we need to recruit them, how to onboard them when they come, and then what kind of evaluation. That's at the heart of the board culture. The Finance Committee is essential. You know, you can't run a deficit, let's be frank. You know, otherwise you're not going to be around much longer. But it is that Governance Committee that's willing to stand up and say, here's what we need to do. We, first person plural, need to do to improve the work that we're engaged in. So any chairs also chair the Governance Committee? Yeah, good. It's a pretty, I think it's the most important committee on the board if you really want to think about board culture and the future. So here's some behavior that has a negative impact on board culture. I'm sure no one has seen this on any of the boards that you've been involved in, right? First of all, there's the power broker or decision maker who comes in because in your company, in your family, in your church, whatever it is, you're a decision maker and you make really good decisions. And I think that's why the head of school asked me to be on this board, because I am a decision maker and I've been successful in doing whatever it is. So that power broker or decision maker comes in and is pretty clear on how things should proceed, lays out the process, and everybody is just expected to follow him or her. Not bad if it's a privately held company and you own it. Quite different in the nonprofit world. The surrogate managers. I love this. Perhaps some of you work for major businesses or corporations where you have a whole bunch of 20 or 30 somethings who are crunching data for you, right? When I worked in Charlotte, Bank of America, and do you remember Wachovia? Anybody remember Wachovia? They used to be a bank in America. Anyways, we're very fortunate to have some of the most senior leaders at the bank on our board and in our parent body. But the CFO used to go crazy with some of those VPs because they would say, hey, we need a ratio on this, and how many left-handed desks do you have, and how many people applied between June and July, and there was just him. There wasn't a whole floor down there in Bank of America who just crunched the data for you. And data is important. We've all bought, we should be data-driven decision makers, right? Okay, nothing wrong with that. But if the manager, if the board chair just wants to look at the data and make decisions, then that's a problem. That doesn't contribute to a positive board culture. I'm a board member of an organization. We're meeting in Washington yesterday, and the board had just done a really wonderful survey. BoardSource did their survey too, as a matter of fact. It was a really good survey from BoardSource about the organization and the membership and the hopes and desires and aspirations and reasons why people join the association or stop joining the association. And we rushed quickly. We looked at the data, saw the slides, and we rushed quickly to talking about what the marketing strategy would be and how we would compete and how would we respond to those data. When someone like Trower would tell us, stop and look at the data and first ask, what do the data tell us about our school? Not where should we go, what's the solution? All you decision makers want to do that, and that's a good thing, you need to do that. But first, what do the data tell us about our school? The number of people, the number of schools who sign up to be members or don't sign up to be members. What means we're not delivering enough services? Okay, but what does that say about who we are, how we define ourselves, and what the values are that we promote? So Trower and company would say, before you look at the data and act on the data, first make what she calls sense of the data. What do the data tell us about our school first? And try and do that. Lobbyists. I was a head of school once where the person on the board, very successful IT guy, all he cared about was IT. That's all. He used to fall asleep during the rest of the board meeting. But he was there, and we chose him because he was all about IT. But if it wasn't about IT, it wasn't worth the conversation. He's the fellow who said to me, Jack, if your students aren't trying to break into your computer system, hack into the grading system, then you're not teaching them to be innovative. It was an early definition of disruption. I said, well, that's interesting. Thanks for that feedback. But anyways, the lobbyists who advocate for a particular policy, or the folks who come into your office, heads of school, and all they want to talk about is safety and security. Important issue? Absolutely, right? People come to independent schools, the data tell us. One of the top reasons they come is because it's a safe environment, because it's a nurturing environment. But the board member who only wants to talk about that, who only cares about that issue, doesn't, as Reisman tells us, point us and protect the future from the present. The heads of school have to do that? Yes. The boards have to pay attention to that? Yes. But if that's the single issue that this board member has, he or she isn't contributing to the positive board culture. And then there are the renegades. These are the folks who, I forgot the journalists, I'll come back. The renegades are the folks who Chase says don't think independently, which is a characteristic of a good board member, but act independently. They just go off on their own research study. You know, what's one of the major problems in independent schools today? Finding affordable housing for faculty nearby, right? That's a big issue. So I tell you of an incident where the board member said, I don't know who he said it to him, I guess to himself. He decided that he would look at the real estate prices and the rental prices in the rental market within a, 10-mile area of school, and figured out what those were. Then he found his way somehow to find out what the average salary was. We give the board, ranges. So he found out what the average salary was. He also then, because he was close to everybody, he found out who lived alone, who had a partner that worked outside the home, who didn't have a partner that worked outside the home. This is for 150 people. And he did this incredible study, and in essence, he concluded no one who works here can afford to live within, 15 miles of here, which was an interesting conclusion. But when he first presented it to the board, everyone said, did Jack ask you to do that? Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Did the head of school ask you to do that? Or where did this come from? So acting independently and thinking independently are two different things. A board needs to act as a group, and needs to act together. And if that was an initiative that the board wanted to engage in, bravo, brava. But acting independently as that journalist, or as that renegade, doesn't help. The journalist, I love this one. So how many of you have faculty who have been at the school at least 15 years? How about 20 years? Look at the room. There's a lot of people. Those individuals took good care, if you're a K-12 school, or if you're past the K-12, your K-8, those individuals took good care of your children when they were in the first grade or in the third grade. Now you may have a child in the high school, or you may be, as we would hope, a parent of a student who has graduated and serving on the board. But when the issue comes up, when the head of school comes up and says, we're having trouble finding housing for the faculty, the journalist on the board says, no problem, Jack, I'll go talk to Mrs. Jones. She's been here for 30 years. She took care of my kids. I went to the baptisms and the weddings and the funerals of her mother, and I can find out information for you. And they scurry around like little mice, and they collect information. And no one asked them to do that, but they're collecting it. Remember, when you walk in the room, you know this. When you walk in the room, as wonderful as your relationship may be with Mrs. Smith over the last decade, or as lovely as she has been to work with your sons and daughters, Mrs. Smith sees a board member walking in the room. And she thinks, well, this is interesting. The board's interested in real estate prices. So she tells them everything. And there's not wrong with collecting that data, except for the fact that the board didn't ask for those data. So the journalists are like, there is a problem in the fourth grade. I'll take care of it, Jack. Mrs. Jones, she was the best fourth grade teacher we ever had 20 years ago. I'll go talk to her. I'll find out what's really going on. Or sometimes they just bypass the head. What does he know? He's new. He just got here. I'll find out what's really going on. So those journalists sort of scurry about and collect information. it's a problem. It's not an indicator of a positive board culture where people are working together, where those common goals exist. So be careful. The question is, are there guidelines and norms? Do you present to me as a new board member how you want me to behave, how you want me to interact with the faculty? It's impossible for you to go to parent-teacher night and for the teacher to think that they're just talking to little Jack's mom or dad. Absolutely impossible. And faculty work hard, they try hard, but they say, yeah, right, you're a board member. And that's not a fault of theirs, it's not a fault of yours. It's just part of the complication. So we need to have ways to make sure you know what the norms are for interacting with the faculty. It's fair to them and it's good for you because it leads into a positive board culture.